Hello and welcome back to my channel, Civil War Reports. I am your War of the Rebellion reporter, Brian Thomas Kopak, and today I'm standing next to what I believe to be still the newest Civil War era statue here in Gettysburg. I'm standing next to a statue for Congressman Thaddeus Stevens, a radical Republican during the American Civil War. In this episode, we're going to look at Congressman Stevens from his birth up to the start of the American Civil War. Stick around to the end and I will give you my opinion on this very controversial radical Republican. So as I mentioned, this, I believe, is still the newest Civil War era statue here in Gettysburg. The monument here was dedicated on April 2nd in the year 2022, just 2 days shy of what would have been Thaddeus Stevens' 230th birthday. So he was born on April 4th in the year 1792. And I want to take a moment to point out something about this statue that was very real for Thaddeus Stevens. Here is real life Thaddeus Stevens. You notice he has a cane and his foot is a little deformed. He was born with a club foot, and I believe that this physical disability played a lot into his adult life. So what can we say about Thaddeus Stevens? Well, he was born on April 4th, 1792, to Joshua and Sarah Stevens, and he would be the second of 4 children. He was born with the club foot, as I mentioned, and this would really play on his development. I am not a psychiatrist or a psychologist, but I did have to take some psychology classes in college. And I firmly believe that a lot of the events that happen to somebody in their childhood will affect them as an adult. So his father was very athletic, and obviously with a club foot that pained the man every time he walked, Thaddeus would not be an athlete, but his mother will be a major factor in developing his brain. Okay, his mother knew that he would not be able to do physical labor, so he was going to have to get by in life using the gray matter between the ears. So, when Thaddeus was about 12 years old, in the year 1804, his father abandoned the family, leaving the mother to raise 4 children on her own. And when the War of 1812 came, Thaddeus's older brother was killed during the War of 1812. And as a result, the mother became very, very protective of her 3 remaining children, especially to Thaddeus. And she really instilled in him a very strong academic work ethic. Because of the club foot, he couldn't engage in the normal play activities that young children would engage in, and he became the brunt of jokes and ridicule. Because back in those days, people who were born with physical deformities, well, they really were the subject of lots of jokes and ridicule. And Thaddeus Stevens was no exception. And I believe that that played a factor as he got older. Also, a year after Thaddeus' father abandoned the family, a fever epidemic broke out in their area. Thaddeus was born in Danville, Massachusetts, and the mother took it upon herself to nurse many of the sick in her town, and Thaddeus was there to see this, and he didn't forget that either. And I think that also plays into when he becomes an adult, the need to help those who cannot help themselves. And between the father leaving and the club foot, and the mother really giving when she did not have much herself to give to help those who were sick during that epidemic, really does shape who Thaddeus Stevens would become. Also, I want to point out that when Thaddeus is older, adult Thaddeus, when he's a lawyer and he's in Congress, he will speak very highly of his mother and really doesn't talk about his father at all. The fact that the father abandoned him, abandoned his siblings, and abandoned his mother is something that Thaddeus never forgot. For those interested in wanting to visit the Thaddeus Stevens Monument, it is located on Baltimore Street in front of the modern courthouse, and it is just 1 block south of the town square. Next to the monument is this placard dedicated to Thaddeus Stevens, also known as the Great Commoner. There are his years, 1792 to 1868. And this placard here is very well detailed about things he did during his lifetime that made him the Great Commoner. So, in case you're asking yourself, why is there a statue to Thaddeus Stevens in Gettysburg? Well, he certainly didn't fight in a battle, and he certainly didn't come with Abraham Lincoln in November of 1863 to dedicate the cemetery. No, there's a statue of Thaddeus Stevens in Gettysburg because he actually lived here for about 26 years. You see, when he graduated college in 1814, the following year he took a friend's advice and to move out to York, Pennsylvania, which Thaddeus Stevens did in 1815. But he didn't find York to be the land of milk and honey. So a year later, he moved here to Adams County, and he had a house right here where the glass slipper is now, and the Thai restaurant is. Well, he would be here for another 26 years. He'd come here in 1816 and move out in 1842. But while he was here, he certainly made a name for himself. If you are a longtime watcher of this channel, you might recognize where I'm at. I'm back at where I filmed my very first episode, where I talked about General Jubal Early's division marching from Chambersburg towards Gettysburg, and they stopped off here. You might recognize that building in the background. That's about the only building left standing at what was Thaddeus Stevens Iron Works, which he had right here in Caledonia. It is now a state park. If you come to Gettysburg and you have some extra time on your hands, please make the trip west out Route 30. We're about 15 miles, where I'm standing right now, 15 miles west of Gettysburg along Route 30, about 11 miles east of Chambersburg. This is a really nice state park. There's a public pool off to my left if you come here in the summertime. Right in front of me, you may be able to hear it. There's a really nice stream. It's a really nice state park, but this was Thaddeus Stevens Iron Works. It was a very large complex, encompassed many acres, and this is kind of why he was known as the Great Commoner. He ran this operation along with several other businesses of his at a loss, just to provide jobs for people. And out here at Caledonia was no exception. I mentioned, as I said, a lot of acres. There was dormitories here for workers, and unfortunately for Those workers, when Jubal Early's division came through, they did stop off here, took a lot of finished goods, a lot of iron works that could be used for the Confederate war effort, and then pretty much burned it to the ground, including the dormitories. But by the time Thaddeus Stevens moved away from Adams County and went to Lancaster, due to his generosity, shall we say, he was about $250,000 in debt due to running businesses like this at a loss just to provide jobs. And let's face it, $250,000 in today's 2024 money is a large sum of money to be in debt. Just imagine what that was like in 1840s money. So he was known as the Great Commoner, and he really did live up to that reputation. And this ironworks that was here is a classic example of that. As I mentioned, there's a lot of nice stuff to see and do here at the Caledonia State Park, which was home to Thaddeus Stevens Ironworks. If you have some extra time when you're visiting the Gettysburg area, I do recommend a trip out here. You can go on the Thaddeus Stevens Historic Trail, and as I mentioned, the public pool. It's a really nice place. But getting back to Thaddeus Stevens himself, while he was still living in the Gettysburg area, he suffered what he called brain fever, which was probably typhoid fever, and as a result he lost all of his hair and he began to wear a wig for the duration of his life. Shortly after leaving Gettysburg in the early 1840s and moving out to Lancaster, he began what was probably the most talked about and probably the most controversial part of his private life, not his public life, because that's loaded with a lot of controversies and lots to talk about there. But shortly after moving out to Lancaster, he began what many believe was an affair with Lydia Hamilton Smith, a mulatto woman, a widow who had 2 children of her own. She became Thaddeus Stevens' housekeeper, and by all accounts, a lot of the theory just sort of points to the fact that there probably most likely was a sexual relationship between the two. And this was at a time in American history when race mixing was really pretty much not even allowed, let alone frowned upon. But Lydia stayed with Thaddeus for the duration of his life, and again, by all accounts, they did have a sexual relationship. There's really no doubt about it that Thaddeus Stevens made his fortune and also lost his fortune and made a name for himself in Gettysburg and in Adams County in general. In 1842, he moves out to Lancaster and establishes a law office on Queen Street there. But as his star was rising, being a very successful lawyer in the Gettysburg area, he also got involved in politics. And in 1824, he was fiercely outspoken against Andrew Jackson running for president. Well, let's take a look at it, and it's very easy to understand why. Jackson was a major slaveholder, and he was also a very well-known, fierce Indian fighter. Basically, 2 of the most oppressed groups of people in the United States at that time. And Thaddeus Stevens, the Great Commoner, made a name for himself, a reputation as defending and helping the average person, the average man, the average woman. When he moves out to Lancaster, he becomes even more outspoken against slavery, and he vows that he will never, ever vote for a slaveholder ever again. But politics makes for some strange bedfellows, as the old saying goes, and there's no doubt about it, Thaddeus Stevens was a very strange bedfellow. Despite saying he would never vote for a slaveholder, in the election of 1848, he throws his support behind General Zachary Taylor, who was a slaveholder, running on the Whig Party platform. And Thaddeus Stevens, at that point in time, was a Whig himself. And in 1848, not only is Zachary Taylor elected to the White House, that is the first time that Thaddeus Stevens is elected to Congress. He would run again for re-election in 1850 and be re-elected, but he would choose not to run again in 1852. Back on the Gettysburg battlefield, the Eternal Peace Memorial here. Peace eternal in a nation united. Can't help but wonder what Thaddeus Stevens would think of this monument. For this brief bio of the life of Thaddeus Stevens, I'm only taking you up to the beginning of the American Civil War. I know there's going to be plenty of episodes coming down the road in which Thaddeus Stevens will be mentioned. And I want to let you know, for the two main sources I use for this book here, Thaddeus Stevens, Scourge of the South by Fawn M. Brody, and Thaddeus Stevens, 19th Century Egalitarian by Hans L. Trefouse. Last name is spelled Trefousse. I wish I was better with names than I am, but unfortunately, well, I am what I am. I wonder what Thaddeus Stevens would think of me ending this episode in front of a British-made Whitworth cannon that was utilized by the Confederacy, but kind of gives you an idea of how I feel about Thaddeus Stevens. I got to tell you, having read more about his life using these two main sources, I have a better understanding of him, and my respect for him went up a little bit, and I didn't have much to begin with. I believe that events that happen in your childhood really do have a major effect on your adulthood. The fact that he was born with a handicap, his club foot, he was unable to participate in a lot of the games that other children his age would have participated in, the physical activities, had an effect on him in later life. Also, the fact that his father ran out on him at a young age, and I think his mother had a very good effect on him. The fact that she gave so willingly, especially during fever that plagued their hometown when Thaddeus was a young boy. All of that, I think, comes into play. I think the fact that he himself was the subject of ridicule as a child was a double-edged sword. I believe that it made him the great commoner, that he wanted to look out and help the less fortunate, whether they worked in his ironworks or whether they were slaves. And I think he viewed the slaves as probably, why not? They were probably the least fortunate of all Americans. And I think that's probably what drove him to be as anti-slavery as he was, because of the fact that they were so unfortunate, so ridiculed, like he was as a child. I think he saw himself in some ways maybe as a mother figure, because he really didn't have a father figure in his life, that he was going to be their protector. So I think a lot of his childhood played a major role. And also because he suffered such ridicule as a child because of his handicap, that when he got older and in a position of power, that he then exercised that power to ridicule others, particularly the South, okay? Where I don't respect Thaddeus Stevens. And I understand civil wars are different than other types of wars, and the part I don't understand about civil wars is particularly American Civil War, when the North looked at the South and said, well, you can't leave our Union. And to prove that we don't want you to leave, to prove that we love you, to prove that you are our brothers, and this is true particularly by 1864, we're going to burn your homes, burn your farms, burn your land, burn your factories, tear up your railroads, and rape your women. And Thaddeus Stevens really supported all of those things, maybe not the raping of the women, but certainly he supported destroying the South. And, you know, Thaddeus Stevens may have been a great congressman to have if you're fighting an external enemy. I just don't agree with those type of tactics when you're fighting an internal enemy, which is what a civil war is. Again, I'm sure I'm going to be mentioning Thaddeus Stevens quite a lot. I may do a separate episode of just him during the Civil War. This episode only takes us up to the Civil War to give you a background of what his life was like. Beginning on March 1st, I'm told, there's going to be a new museum opening up in Gettysburg dedicated just to the life of Thaddeus Stevens. Hopefully I'll get a chance to do an episode there. I believe the address is going to be 46 Chambersburg Street. Basically across the street and a few shops up the road from, well, my favorite restaurant, the Gettysburg. If you're coming to Gettysburg this year, please come to the Gettysburg. Anyway, that's it for now on the topic of Thaddeus Stevens. For Civil War Reports, I am your War of the Rebellion reporter, Brian Thomas Kopak. Until next time, thank you for watching. And if you like what you saw today, please hit the subscribe button. Give a thumbs up. Also, notify your friends. Let them know about this channel and ask them to subscribe as well. If you like, you may leave a question or a comment below, and perhaps I will answer your question in a future episode of Civil War Reports. Until next time, please keep the history alive.